On Daf 132 of Shabbat, we get this logical inference from this one rabbi, and it seems to make a lot of sense. What is he saying? He's saying that we know that Brit Milah, circumcision, can take place on Shabbat, despite the fact that it violates the rules of normal Shabbat. So if you're allowed to violate the rules of Shabbat in order to do something that involves one limb, just the circumcision, for part of the body, then clearly you can violate Shabbat for saving a life, which involves the entire body, right? Good logical inference. It makes sense. If you have one, which just involves a tiny part of the body, and you can break the Shabbat for that, then you can certainly do so for something that involves the entire body. But the other rabbis don't like that. They say, we can't use logical inferences in all cases. For instance, we say this whole rule about being able to violate Shabbat for a circumcision, for Brit Milah, is what we call a halacha the Moshe Sinai. That it's a halacha, it's a rule that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai. And those are not things that we look at in a logical sense. There are certain things that we look at logically and other things that we don't make inferences from. And if we just have a tradition, what this is really, it's just a tradition that this is how we do it. And we can't learn out from one tradition to something else that we also want to call tradition. If A, then B works when we have a logical structure with something, and sometimes we do, but when it's just a tradition that we do things a certain way, we don't necessarily apply a logical structure. So when else does it actually make sense to not be using logical structures? Logic is good, right? But we can't always rely upon it. So for instance, one thing I've seen over and over again is sometimes people will choose to apply a logical reason to something that we don't have a reason for necessarily, and then try to make other inferences based on that. So for instance, I've heard people say, the reason why the Torah said we should not eat pork is because back then they had a big issue with trichinosis, this disease that comes from eating pork. And therefore they made laws that say, okay, you shouldn't eat this. As opposed to these days when we've got a different health system, trichinosis is not such a big issue. Therefore, we don't need to worry about this law. So if you create a logical reason for it, it might not really be the reason at all. The Torah doesn't say don't eat pork because of trichinosis. It says don't eat pork. It's not giving you a logical reason. And if you try to apply logical reason, you can then use that as a way of getting out of things. In fact, we see with King Solomon that, he used all of his wisdom to try to get out of some things. It said that you should not have too many horses or else you'll go back to Egypt. You shouldn't have too many wives or else they'll turn your heart astray. And King Solomon looked at these things, and these were some of the exceptions in the Torah where they had logical reasons for things. And he says, okay, well, it's telling me the traps. It's telling me what I need to avoid. I'll use my wisdom to avoid, falling into those traps. And he fell into those traps because wisdom wasn't really necessarily part of it. We can't necessarily use logic. So for these other rules, certainly, which don't tell us logic, we can't use logic. And this just came up in a way that struck me as in a very personal regard just this past week, because I was looking at everything that was happening with Corona. And a lot of things that people were doing and that countries were doing and that policies were being applied didn't strike me as very logical. And it seems like we're acting in this very illogical way. There are so many diseases, so many illnesses that people have suffered that might have been even more severe for this, and we didn't have this incredible shut down the entire world, shut down the entire economy type response. But then I took a step back and I realized, well, what if this whole thing is not meant to be logical? What if, we've been looking at the way the world is working, and I used to be an environmental activist, and I see there's so much environmental destruction going on, and the ways we're reacting to the world, like it's not sustainable. We can absolutely destroy the entire world the way we're going. There need to be shifts, not in the way we live, shifts in consciousness. We need there to be changes, transitions in the world. Maybe Corona is helping bring a different level of consciousness. It's part of this transition, part of the shifting that has to happen in the world. And that really it's happening in a very sweet way, because if we were to act logically, we might need to allow the type of shifts that are actually happening in the world, these shifts in consciousness, these shifts in materialism. But because we're acting illogically, we could have a disease that might be a little bit less severe. So less severe disease plus illogical reaction equals the shift we want. Or logical reaction plus a very severe disease would equal that same shift. So maybe the illogical response, maybe it's part of the whole thing. Maybe we shouldn't react to this too logically. Maybe we shouldn't get upset at the illogical responses. Maybe we should look at, actually, no, we have a new reality coming into this world. And illogic might actually be part of what is fueling that, to allow us to go through something that isn't as severe as we would need. We talk about the days of Mashiach, the days of Messiah coming in Judaism. And sometimes people say, like, wow, it'd be amazing, but I don't necessarily want to be alive for it, because a lot of our texts say it's going to be something that is really, really severe, really, really harsh. Maybe illogical responses is part of what is allowing us to go through this in a way that is not as harsh as it might otherwise be. So we learn from today's daf that sometimes logic, it's got its place, but doesn't always necessarily apply. And sometimes other aspects have to take greater precedence over even logic.